There's a sense that we're going back into a self-help world in which you can't trust international law, you can't trust international institutions.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says the death toll in Gaza is now more than 60,000 people since the start of the war.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battlelines. It's Monday, 22nd of September, 2025. It's UN week, with the world's leaders descending on New York to discuss diplomacy, conflict, and trade deals. To mark the 80th high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly, I'm going to be asking, is the UN still relevant? The organisation is faced with numerous brutal conflicts it's been unable to solve, a cash crisis, deep polarisation among its members, a bloated bureaucracy, and the waning interest of its biggest backer, the US. I'll be speaking to a veteran UN watcher who says the body is rotting from the top and asking if it will still be around in 10 years' time. But first, let's start with one of the main talking points at the UN this week, the wave of Western countries recognising a Palestinian state. Yesterday, the UK, Canada, Australia and Portugal all formally recognised Palestine, and they're joined by France and Belgium today. The shift has been spurred by Israel's intensifying bombardment of Gaza, which was last week deemed a genocide by a UN Commission of Inquiry. There's also a famine underway in Gaza City. Recognising Palestine as a state is largely symbolic, but it's still a massive shift in policy. It's been heavily criticised by Israel, the US, and much of the global Jewish community, who've called it a betrayal and a reward for Hamas's appalling terror attack on October 7th. They've said there should be no recognition while Hamas is still holding nearly 50 Israeli hostages that it kidnapped on October 7th, around 20 of whom are believed to still be alive. Palestinians have reacted with cautious joy. It's something they've pushed for decades, but it's unlikely to end the war in Gaza or Israeli settlement building in the West Bank. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said he hoped the move would revive the hope of peace and a two-state solution. And today, France and Saudi Arabia are co-hosting a conference on the two-state solution at the UN. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has responded by saying a Palestinian state will not happen. And he's probably right. To explain why, I'm joined in the studio by our Chief Foreign Affairs commentator, David Blair. Now, David, you've written an excellent piece for us about why the two-state solution is dead, and I want to talk about that. But just first, given you spent years working in Number 10, writing speeches about what you say in diplomatic speak is called 2SS, the two-state solution, why do you think the UK has chosen to change its position on this issue?
Well, it's been the long-standing position of British governments for many years that Britain will recognise Palestine as a state at the right moment. And suddenly, this government has decided that now is the right moment. And I think the answer to that, although they won't say it in public, is the objection previously was always, if you do it, you will disrupt relations with Israel, you will reduce your influence with Israel, and they will be a lot less likely to listen to you. But that objection has really fallen away because it's been obvious now for a while that the Israelis aren't listening to the British government anyway. I mean, the British have been saying in private for a long while and now in public for quite a while as well that they want the Gaza war to end, that they see it as being futile, that they think the bloodshed is indefensible. But the Israelis have carried on anyway. So from the British government's point of view, there simply was no reason not to recognise Palestine.
But as you lay out in your piece, there are plenty of reasons why it's essentially meaningless. You've got a very good line. Here's a hard fact that you'll never hear from our Prime Minister. A Palestinian state will not and probably cannot exist. That sounds like it's roughly aligned with Israeli rhetoric. Benjamin Netanyahu has said exactly the same thing, that a Palestinian state will never exist. And lots of his far-right ministers have said the same thing. But your logic is slightly different. Can you talk us through why the reality on the ground means that it's almost impossible for a two-state solution to be implemented now?
Yes. Leave aside the desirability or otherwise of a Palestinian state. Let's just assume that it is desirable for the sake of argument. The question is it achievable? And my answer to that, and quite a lot of people would agree with me, I think, is that it's not achievable. It is no longer achievable. The moment when you could have created a Palestinian state based on the West Bank and Gaza has passed now. And the reality is that the West Bank, the very geography of the West Bank has changed so as to make it almost impossible to create a viable Palestinian state. Two things have happened, really. First of all, Israel has sliced and diced the territory in such a way that you really couldn't put together a contiguous expanse of territory that would work as a sovereign Palestinian state. So the West Bank is currently divided into three areas. The biggest of those three areas, Area C, about 60% of the total, is under complete Israeli control. The Palestinian Authority has very limited control over areas A and B, which comprise about 40% of the territory. But when you look at the map, you see that areas A and B consist of blobs and tentacles and little enclaves here and there. So if you're going to turn that into a viable state, Israel would have to withdraw from large expanses of territory. But they're not going to do that, not least because they've built settlements right the way across the West Bank, which currently have about 500,000 Israeli inhabitants. No Israeli government, never mind Benjamin Netanyahu, under any prime minister, is going to start dragging out tens of thousands of their own citizens and evicting them from their homes and bulldozing their homes behind them to make way for a Palestinian state. It's simply not going to happen. And the second reason is Hamas terrorism over the decades has destroyed any constituency in Israel that might once have supported Palestinian statehood in the cause of peace. So if you go back to the Oslo Accords, which remain the only formal peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, signed back in 1993, as soon as they were signed, Hamas launched a campaign of suicide bombings in Israeli cities. And that had the effect of discrediting the whole idea of signing peace agreements with the Palestinians, because ordinary Israelis pointed out that once you sign these agreements, you don't get peace, you just get terrorism.
So why, given the reality on the ground is very much against it, and we're seeing the most immediate impact of Western countries recognising a Palestinian state is Israeli and American ire. We've had Yvette Cooper saying that she's told her Israeli counterparts quite firmly that they mustn't annex any more of the West Bank in reaction to this, which sounds completely meaningless. Why are they doing it then? It seems to have almost no impact on the ground other than being a sort of quite nice bit of diplomatic grandstanding at the UN, ahead of the UN General Assembly high-level meetings.
They're doing it because they want to preserve the illusion that the two-state solution is still possible. And I can understand why they want to preserve that illusion, because the two-state solution probably is the only way in which you could, at least in theory, settle the Arab-Israeli conflict. And if you believe that the two-state solution is no longer viable, which, alas, a lot of people do, then the future is very bleak indeed. The future is one of indefinite conflict. And governments, diplomats, particularly in this country, that they want to be constructive, they want to be helpful. They can't say or even allow themselves to believe that the future is one of indefinite conflict. And so they have to trot out mantras about the two-state solution and take this step to try and keep it alive, as they would say. But you and I, Venetia, are in a different position. We're journalists. We don't have to be helpful to anybody. Our job is to report reality. And that's our only job, even when reality is very uncomfortable. And here the reality is deeply uncomfortable. The reality is that the only possible solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, the two-state solution, is no longer viable. And therefore the future is one of indefinite conflict. Diplomats can't say that kind of thing, but we journalists can, and I think we should.
The other solution that sometimes people talk about, and maybe we should explain why that's also a very uncomfortable one, is a one-state solution, which would mean, as you point out, sort of roughly 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Israelis all living together in one big country, which is something that neither of them want, but most of all would destroy the idea of a Jewish state for the Jewish people, right?
Well, the one-state solution is... Well, it's no solution at all, because the reality is that neither of the two peoples will ever consent to being governed by the other. I mean, that's really the point. And if you're going to have a single harmonious state, then one side or the other would have to accept being governed by the other. And if you look at demographic reality, if it hasn't happened already, it will happen before long, that there will be an Arab majority in the Holy Land. And would the Israelis ever consent to being a minority? I can't imagine that they would. So that is no answer. That is a blind alley. Alas, the two-state solution is also a blind alley. So the reality is that we're facing a future of indefinite conflict. And I repeat the point I made earlier. Governments and diplomats can't say that kind of thing, but we journalists can.
You mentioned timing, and I'm sure a lot of this was timed to be ahead of this UN high-level meeting, so it looks nice and shiny and they can try and do something while everyone's together in New York. But for Israel's supporters and for America in particular, the timing of this suggests that they are rewarding Hamas. Hamas is still holding around 50 hostages, only around 20 of whom are believed to still be alive. And the American and Israeli position has always been Hamas should release all the hostages and then we can get talking about anything else. Why has that not swayed the UK to stick with America on this crucial issue?
It's a very good question. And, why didn't they set a precondition that they would only recognise Palestine as a state once all the hostages were free and once a peace agreement had been reached? I suspect from their point of view, the answer would have been if they'd set a condition like that, then they would have ended up not doing it at all. And they were determined to do it. And they were determined to do it above all because they believe that Israel has systematically ignored all their concerns and all their objections about the way the war in Gaza has been fought, and they wanted to send a signal to Israel. They also want to send, in fairness, a signal to the Palestinian Authority that in return for this big diplomatic victory for them, that the Palestinian Authority needs to reform. But that's a whole new subject because, again, here's a reality which you and I can discuss, Venetia, but diplomats prefer not to. The president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, is almost 90 years old, and he spent 20 years strangling any prospects of reforming or improving the Palestinian Authority. He should be there trying to build up the institutions of a future Palestinian state. Instead, if memory serves, he was elected for a 4-year term in 2005. So if my maths are correct, he's now into the 16th year of his 5-year term. Or of his 4-year term. It's ridiculous. He should be calling the Palestinian Parliament, the Palestinian Legislative Council into being, but it hasn't met, I think I'm right in saying, since 2007. There are protests about the war in Gaza, about the fate of the Palestinians in cities all the way across the world, including London, but oddly enough, not really in the West Bank. That's not because people in the West Bank don't care about the issue. Of course they care about the issue. But Mahmoud Abbas will not allow popular protests because he fears that they'll all turn on him because he's so desperately unpopular and utterly discredited. The idea that he will now reform the Palestinian Authority is absurd. It's not going to happen.
David Blair, the Telegraph's chief foreign affairs commentator. Coming up after the break, will the UN still be around in 10 years' time? Welcome back. Now, as mentioned, it's UN General Assembly High-Level Week. That means that this week we'll see world leaders of all stripes coming together in New York, from US President Donald Trump to Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa, from Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. That all sounds quite fancy, but the UN is in crisis. There are growing doubts about what its purpose is and whether it can survive in its current form as the post-World War II international order continues to break down. So what's going wrong, and does it still do anything well? To discuss this, I'm joined by Richard Gowan, longtime UN watcher and the UN director at US think tank International Crisis Group. Richard, welcome to Battlelines. I know it's very early where you are. How are you doing?
Well, I have a bad case of UN General Assembly, but that's an annual affliction.
Explain to our listeners what that means. Why do you find this, I'm guessing from your voice, a slightly tedious affair?
Well, for 51 weeks of the year, the UN, for all its flaws, works on serious things like peacekeeping and humanitarian aid. And then for 1 week of the year, it turns into a circus. And we have over 100 presidents and prime ministers and their retinues, plus innumerable journalists and NGO folk descending on Manhattan to talk about the state of the world. New York, and especially the east side of Manhattan, becomes a zoo. And when you're in the middle of all this, it does feel quite important. It feels like you are at the center of global diplomacy. But the funny thing is, very little actually comes out of all this yakking.
I want to just start by zooming out a bit. The International Crisis Group, where you work, does an annual report about the UN, what it does well, what it doesn't. Can you just start by walking us through some examples of what you think the UN does still do well before we get into the more negative side of things?
There are a lot of negatives, but the reality is that the UN is out there providing support to over 100 million people around the world in places that are otherwise forgotten. So if you are a Rohingya refugee in Myanmar, if you are a civilian under threat of violence in South Sudan, the only organization that is going to come to your aid is the UN. And the UN has lost a lot of salience, I think, in global politics over the last decade or so, but it is still the best organization at providing humanitarian assistance, in particular, food, vaccinations, shelter. And so it's very easy to dismiss the UN, but I think we should remember that for a lot of people around the world, it is the only safety net they have.
And what about the stuff that it doesn't do so well? Can you give us some examples of how the UN has become perhaps bloated beyond reason?
So, the UN was founded 80 years ago, and it has expanded in a haphazard fashion ever since. And so you do have a very wide range of UN agencies around the world, many of which do duplicate each other's activities, and they compete for funding. And I think everyone, up to and including the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, appreciates that there is space for rationalization. And so right now, in a period when the US has taken funding away from a lot of these organizations, I think there's a necessary reckoning coming, and we're going to be having to look at those sort of overlaps and saying, okay, the UN does still provide essential assistance around the world, but it's got to do it in a much more streamlined fashion.
Let's focus then on the US aspect of this, because the US is, supposed to be the organisation's political and financial engine in many ways, and I know it contributes an outsized portion of the budgets of, for example, the World Food Programme, which you mentioned, or UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency. Trump has always been quite sceptical about the UN, not a big fan of multilateralism. If the US was to completely withdraw, which we don't think is happening, but for the US to freeze its involvement, to the huge swinging cuts to US aid that we've seen that I know have gutted a lot of the UN's humanitarian work, can you talk us through what the impact of the US withdrawing from this body has been over the course of this year and where you think that might be going?
So, the most immediate impact of Trump's policies has been on the financial front. We have seen the US basically cut off all funding to the UN's core budget and also to the peacekeeping budget, which covers the Blue Helmet missions in places like Lebanon. The US has also reduced its humanitarian spending to a trickle, which, as you mentioned, has a huge impact on the biggest aid agencies that have always been very reliant on Washington for their money. But it's not just about funding. There's also a pattern of the US ghosting the UN diplomatically. So this year, there have been negotiations in various different UN centers around things like information sharing in future pandemics and protecting the oceans, and American diplomats simply haven't turned up. Now, that doesn't stop other countries negotiating. The UN did actually agree a treaty on pandemics back in the summer. But obviously, if you don't have the US providing capital or political capital to these processes, they lose a lot of credibility. And then when the US does turn up at UN meetings, it's often behaving in a really disruptive fashion. And American diplomats, many of whom clearly don't believe that the lines that they're reading, but nonetheless, they're going into UN meetings and saying that you shouldn't talk about gender, you shouldn't talk about sustainability because these are woke concepts. So, you're damned if you have the US in the room, and you're damned if you don't.
And that's quite a body blow, right, for the UN. We have these sustainable development goals that are supposed to carry us through to 2030, and a lot of it does focus on things like gender, climate change, development, things that American right-wing, the current administration, might describe as woke. And those concepts are falling out of favour, not just in America, but here in the UK, other parts of Europe. They've never been particularly in favour in places like Russia and China. How does the UN survive and evolve to meet these changing global views?
I think we should be honest with ourselves. The UN was not in great shape before President Trump returned to office. I mean, actually, if you look across its activities, it's not a pretty picture. So the UN is meant to be leading efforts to end extreme poverty around the world by 2030. That's just not going to happen. Since the COVID pandemic created an economic shock, development has been going in a negative direction in many areas. We clearly are not going to meet the UN's climate targets on global warming. And then in the Security Council, politics has been extremely difficult, especially since Russia's all-out aggression against Ukraine. So, the Trump administration has exacerbated a lot of these problems, and I think the Trump administration has brought a lot of these problems into view. But I think we need to do some fairly serious thinking, not only about how the UN survives financially over the next 5 to 10 years, but also about what its role is in a much more competitive, much more difficult geopolitical environment. Now, I think the UN can actually still play an important role in managing, or at least mitigating, the problems that we're seeing today. It is still a place where the big powers meet on a regular basis. For all their differences, China, Russia, and the US do actually agree on quite a lot of things in the Security Council. It's not a completely paralyzed body. But people who work around the UN look back to the 1990s, to the moment of cooperation we had after the Cold War, with a lot of nostalgia. And I think we're not going back to the 1990s, even if Oasis is back. We're not going back to a moment of sort of very advanced international cooperation. We've got to accept that the UN is there to try and maintain a minimum of global interactions that stop a lot of problems getting worse.
I wonder what you think the sort of then core of the UN's mission could be. I think for me and for many others it might be conflict resolution, but we've seen 3 particularly brutal conflicts ongoing over the last few years: Gaza, Ukraine and Sudan. Very little interest in Sudan. Ukraine heavily divided over and no sense of a solution. We've got Zelensky speaking this week, and also Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And then obviously Gaza, Israel, also heavily divided. If it can't find solutions to some of these major conflicts, then where does its core purpose lie?
So if you look at those 3 conflicts, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. It's not entirely the fault of the UN as an institution that we're not solving the wars. Russia has a veto over what the Security Council does in regards to Ukraine. The US is using its veto over Gaza. It vetoed a call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza just last week. And the way the UN was set up in 1945, does give the veto powers an incredibly high degree of control over what the organization can do. I actually think Sudan, and maybe some other cases like Haiti, in some ways are actually more reflective of problems in the UN, because they're not first-order geopolitical crises. They are the sort of places where the UN has been fairly effective in the past. I mean, if you go back 20 years, you'll remember that there was a huge amount of discussion about violence in Sudan and how the UN should respond. But there's a sense of drift. Security Council members are not investing in trying to resolve these second-order crises. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is very cautious. He doesn't like putting his political capital on the line to deal with these sorts of situations. And more often than not, what the UN defaults to is providing as much humanitarian aid as it can, rather than looking for political solutions to conflicts. And so, those of us who still have some residual faith in the UN would say, let's try and be a bit more courageous. Antonio Guterres has 15 months left in office. He could use his stature, he could use what political capital he has left to really push on mediation in Sudan, or really push on getting an international stabilization force into Haiti that, could manage gang violence. Those are the sort of places where the UN, I think, could be doing better today. I'm not really sure the UN could do much more over Ukraine, given geopolitical realities, but it should be doing more on some of these other situations.
Do you think the Security Council needs reforming? I know you've written that the UN is rotting from the head down, and also about Biden's failed efforts to get African countries seats on the council.
Well, I've worked on Security Council reform on and off for over 10 years. And I would really like that part of my life back, because it's a very frustrating diplomatic process. I think almost everyone, including the 5 current veto powers, would agree that the council needs reform. I mean, no one looks at the situation we're describing and thinks, yeah, this is great. Even the Russians and the Chinese will say this is not a world security body that is providing security in the way that it should. The problem is, as soon as you get into how you would reform the council, everyone fragments and everyone has different opinions. And so I, for example, think there's a very strong case that India, as the world's most populous nation with nuclear weapons, should have a permanent seat on the Security Council. I think that's a bit of a no-brainer. But my friends at the Chinese mission here in New York are much less enthusiastic about having a second Asian power with a veto at the apex of global affairs. Similarly, there's a solid case that Brazil should have a permanent seat, but a lot of Brazil's neighbors, like Argentina and Mexico, don't want to see it raised up. And so council reform discussions are incredibly hard. I think they're sometimes actually a bit of a distraction from dealing with the crises of the moment. And it's also worth saying that while the Biden administration was quite progressive on the idea of council reform, mainly because Biden's people recognized the body was becoming a little bit irrelevant, the Trump administration is not interested at all. And I think US diplomats have been making it very clear to other powers that Trump quite likes the status quo. The Trump world vision is about a few big powers doing deals. And actually, the US has been making nice with the Russians in the Security Council when possible this year, trying to improve relations. I think Washington actually wants to maintain the council as it is, rather than, trying to reform it to make it more credible and more legitimate.
What do you think is the future of UN peacekeeping forces? I know we've just heard that UNIFIL is set to be wrapped in 2027, and that's the peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon that Israel has been pushing for the abolition of.
So UN peacekeeping is one of those parts of the UN system that gets a bad rap, because as soon as you talk about blue helmets, everyone thinks quite justifiably of Rwanda and Srebrenica. But actually, if you look over the arc of the UN's history, peacekeeping is one of its flagship tools. And there are a lot of countries around the world, like Liberia or Sierra Leone, where UN peacekeepers got on the ground, often faced, really big challenges, but actually did, over the medium term, help resolve civil wars and get countries back on their feet. We've been in a period recently where UN peacekeeping has been shrinking, and some of the forces we have still active are in places where the security challenges are really huge, and it's not very clear what the way out is. Places like the Central African Republic. But if you if you look over the history of the UN, peacekeeping has waxed and waned. It's a tool that is often declared to be dead, but then makes a comeback. And I think we're going to go into a period where the number of UN peacekeepers is down. But I would reasonably confidently predict that in 20 years' time, you might find that actually peacekeeping bounces back, because it's something which the UN does reasonably well. And, it is actually a mechanism that can put a lid on crises. So shrinking now, but I suspect it will come back in future.
And shrinking now, is that because of the UN80 initiative by Guterres to try and slim down the UN, bring in lots of budget cuts over the next few years?
The reason that peacekeeping is shrinking now is more to do with the fact that UN missions have checked out of a number of countries, sometimes successfully, and sometimes because they simply couldn't resolve the problems that they were facing. The Malian government expelled peacekeepers 2 years ago, and I think that Mali may now be regretting that because it's seen a resurgence of jihadist violence. The UN80 initiative, which you refer to, is more to do with the inner workings of the UN bureaucracy, because the US is withholding money from the UN Secretariat. Secretary General Guterres, has had no choice but to try and work out where to find savings. And he has basically told the UN Secretariat that it has to shrink by 20% at the start of next year. So a lot of staff are losing jobs. That is, it's an unavoidable cost-cutting exercise. I think there is a longer-term question, which is what we were touching on before. Is it possible to initiate some much bigger UN reforms, like merging the food agencies in Rome, or merging the different agencies that deal with displaced people and refugees? And that would lead to much bigger efficiencies. But Guterres only has 15 months left in office, and the UN moves slowly, even in a crisis. And so I don't think he has the time to implement big mergers like that. So one thing that we're watching around the General Assembly is candidates are coming forward to replace Guterres, people like Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA. And I think it will fall to those guys, the next generation of UN leaders, to undertake some of the really big changes that everyone now acknowledges will have to happen.
What do you make of accusations that the UN is anti-Semitic and the sort of overt focus on things that are happening in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories versus things happening in other conflicts around the world?
I understand why Israel and Israelis are frustrated by the UN. And I think when we look back to October 2023, it is very striking that the UN General Assembly didn't immediately condemn Hamas for the atrocities against Israel. Actually, the General Assembly did finally, just last week, issue a condemnation of Hamas as part of the process leading up to the recognition of Palestine by countries like the UK, but that is a bit late. What I would say, though, is I don't actually think that a lot of UN members are fundamentally against Israel. What they do feel is that the organization has a special responsibility to the Palestinians. And that's almost baked into the history of the institution, because the UN has been dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since the 1940s. And for a lot of members, some of them from the global south, but actually also Western countries like France and the UK, there is a sense that the Palestinian question is a qualitatively different challenge to the UN. Yes, the UN is in Haiti. Yes, the UN is trying to fix problems in Myanmar. But I think a lot of diplomats do feel that there is a sort of profound connection between what the organization can do for the Palestinians and what the institution means on the world stage. So I would see it in those terms, and I think that helps explain why there has been such a focus on Gaza over the last 2 years. An Arab diplomat said to me a year ago, we should have just condemned Hamas immediately. We should have just made it very clear that what Hamas had did was, profoundly unacceptable.
You've been researching how international institutions have fared in past existential crises, why some bodies survive and why others, like the League of Nations, for example, don't. What have you learned, and what has it made you think about whether the UN will still be around in 10 years' time?
So I think the main lesson is that the leaders of international organizations need to get ahead of crises. If you're just always trailing crises, as the UN has sometimes been trailing, I think, US budget cuts this year, then things get worse rather than better. And so, again, I think this is one of the reasons we're talking about leadership and who the next Secretary General will be, because I think it is really important that we have strong UN leadership that, has political credibility, pulling nations together to deal with the problems that we face. But I think it's also, self-evident that the other thing that makes multilateral cooperation work is that states want it to work. And, countries have to believe in an organization like the UN to make it real. And I think we're at a sort of very fragile moment in which you see that a lot of UN member states, especially smaller countries and middle powers that don't get invites to the G20 or don't get invites to the BRICS, still really do want to make the UN work. And that's one reason that a lot of leaders are coming to New York, and we'll be hearing a lot of leaders in the coming days saying that they believe in the UN system. Most countries actually do still want this thing to survive. But I think that in a lot of capitals, there is a real doubt that it will survive, especially if the US maintains its current semi-detached stance. I think that for a lot of countries, there's a sense that we're going back into a self-help world in which you can't trust international law, you can't trust international institutions, and the only keys to security are military power and securing economic resources. And you can hit a tipping point. I think this is what happened to the League of Nations in the 1930s. If most states start to conclude that the UN just is not going to meet their needs, whether it's their security needs or their development needs, they will invest less in it, and the organization will lose altitude. And as it loses altitude, more states will conclude that they should be focusing elsewhere. I don't think that's a guaranteed outcome, but I think it's a very believable outcome right now.
Do you think the UN will still be around in 10 years' time?
I hope so. I think that there is a very realistic scenario where the Security Council goes back to what it was during phases of the Cold War, but largely irrelevant to the security challenges of the day. The General Assembly will probably continue as a talking shop, but it won't be able to get action.
That was Richard Gowan, UN Director at the International Crisis Group. That's all for today's episode of Battlelines. We'll be back again on Friday. Until then, goodbye. Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Max Bauer. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.